Hello, welcome back to Life on the Franch. Today I'm going to be reviewing nonfiction LGBTQ books, but I wanted to review different genres of nonfiction because I know nonfiction can be a category of literature that is very intimidating, especially when it's super academic. So we're going to be reading a variety. So that hopefully there's something in here that can be your foot in the door for a nonfiction LGBTQ piece. And I've picked texts that I feel like are going to be important and going to be impactful. So let's dive into the first book. So the first book I want to talk about that I just finished reading is the Laramie Project, and the Laramie Project 10 years later. So the Laramie Project is a play, a nonfiction play, and the Tectonic Theater Production, which is a company in New York, flew out to Laramie, Wyoming after the death of Matthew Shepard, the brutal murder of Matthew Shepard. And they interviewed residents of the town of Laramie where this hate crime happened, to get a feel for what Laramie is like, how they're dealing with this crime, how the trial went. And I will warn you that the crime itself is very brutal. It's very gruesome, and it happened in 1998. So you can imagine the views of the people in 1998 are not what they would be today in 2022, but I still felt like it was important to read because it was the ignition point for a lot of hate crime bills and activism around preventing hate crime in the future. So I think that if you want to understand where those bills come from, reading about this historic event is important. But I think what I found even more fascinating was part two, which is the Laramie Project 10 years later. So the same Tectonic Theater Production and many of the same interviewers came back to Laramie to see what Laramie was like. How did it change? Did the views of people change? Did they not change? How was Matthew Shepard being honored and remembered? But I think this part of the story was really important and really impactful. So this 10 years later then was in 2008, and what had happened, they found, was the dialogue in Laramie about what happened changed. So while the trial found that it was a hate crime, there was evidence to support it was a hate crime, there was evidence to show there was no drugs involved, many residents of Laramie basically rewrote the history to be about drugs and robbery and not at all about Matthew Shepard's homosexuality. And it talks about denial, and it talks about shame and wanting where you're from to not be tied to something so gruesome and so dark. And I think it's really analogous to the way that the United States as a whole thinks about history, and the way that many white people try to rewrite history to minimize the crimes of the U.S. over time. And I think this is one specific way that you can see how it was done and why it was done. And I want to read just a quote from this about that. This is a quote from the mother of Matthew Shepard, Judy Shepard, who became a longtime activist for hate crime prevention. She writes, I've learned so much about people. She says, I've learned so much about people, what they choose to believe if it makes them feel better, how they have to interpret things to make their own being better, to fit their own image of themselves. It's not just in Laramie, it's Laramie Moises. It's a nationally too. I would very much recommend reading this book. It also talks about the way that news articles and Congress people rewrote history later on outside of Wyoming. 2020 apparently did an investigation into Matthew Shepard's case and basically argued that the police got it wrong and ignored trial evidence and ignored statements from the perpetrators. It's wild. And I think that in addition to it just being a really good book to read because of the way that I think it mirrors so many of the issues facing the United States today, I think this is a book everyone should read. I think if you like true crime, I think you would also like this book. There are interviews from both, like, there's the quotes from the trial, but there are also interviews with the perpetrators 10 years after the fact that are chilling. I just would really recommend this book. It's not a hard read. I read it in a couple hours, but it will stay with me, and I do think that it's an important piece of literature. So without further ado, on to the next. Okay, so I just finished the book Fun Home, a family tragicomic. It's very shiny, so sorry about the light. The whole thing has like a shiny cover, but it's by Alison Bechdel. It was named Best Book of the Year by Time Entertainment Weekly, New York Times, People, USA Today, and it was the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. So it has a lot of praise. The book came out in 2006 is when the copyright is. This edition is the 2007 edition. And what's interesting about this book is it's a memoir, so it's nonfiction, but it's a graphic novel. So, if you're into graphic novels, like, this could be a foray for you into the world of nonfiction. I wouldn't necessarily say it's young adults. Some of the pictures are like graphic towards the end. But I want to talk a little bit about the plot. So basically, the premise of the book is it's written by a lesbian who, grew up, and it's about her family and their family dynamics, and she finds out later, after she comes out, that her dad is actually gay. And he, the dad, when she's in college, kills himself. This book deals with a lot of things that could be triggering. Suicide is one of them. There are some slurs in the book. There's definitely like gender stereotypes. But I think probably the most triggering thing in the book for me was the pedophilia in the book. So the dad is like picking up these young men. So one example they keep going back to is this like 17-year-old like boy that was working in the yard with him, and there are other instances of infidelity, and they talk about like cruising, and it's really interesting. It's like it's a true story, and it's really interesting to hear the perspective of like the child who grew up with this father. Um, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend the book. Um, at the same time, I read it in one day, partially because it's a graphic novel and it's short, but also because I found it very gritty and fascinating. Um, and the relationship between the father and the daughter is very fraught and complex. Um, Another trigger warning is domestic violence. There's just a lot happening in this book. And it's interesting the way that Allison, the author, she talks about the way that homophobia impacted her father in like, and some of maybe his decisions, especially around like, marrying a woman, having a family, and then doing all these like horrible things. It's definitely not written as like an excuse. There's no excuse made in the book. There's no excuse, period. Like, but it's interesting. And then Allison includes some of his letters that he wrote to her after she comes out, and he talks about his own experiences dealing with his sexuality. The other thing that's interesting about the book is the importance of books in their relationship, but also in the author discovering who they are. She describes like going on her own odyssey as reading all of these like feminist and lesbian texts while she's in college. And it just highlights the importance of representation in school, and also like in books and literature in general. It just covers a lot of ground because it covers an entire life. So like, I don't know. Would I recommend it? Like, no, but would I have a lot of thoughts and I would love to talk about it with other people. So I have mixed feelings about it. But to me, it's not something that you like have to read. On to the next book. Okay, so for the next book on this nonfiction LGBTQ review, I want to talk about Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex, by Angela Chen. Angela Chen is a non-binary Chinese-American author, and this book, for me, 9 out of 10. Like, I know most people write it out of 5 stars, so 4.5 out of 5 stars. So this book is written for people who don't identify as asexual primarily. I thought at first going into this book that it was going to be about what is asexuality. And while it touches on that, I still have a few questions. I think I want to read more for sure. One book, and even a good book like this one, is not enough to really understand the asexual experience. But I think this book was a really good introduction. However, I think that it's not just for people who want to be more informed about asexuality. This is a book I would recommend to everyone. It touches on things that affect every single person. I think the title really says it all. It talks about desire and the different kinds of desire: romantic desire, sexual desire, aesthetic finding something aesthetically pleasing versus finding it sexually appealing. What the meaning of sex is. What do we get out of sex as individuals? So it also talks about this idea of compulsory sexuality. So this is a quote. Compulsory sexuality is a set of assumptions and behaviors that support the idea that every normal person is sexual, that not wanting socially approved sex is unnatural and wrong, and that people who don't care about sexuality are missing out on an utterly necessary experience. And it talks about the way that compulsory sexuality impacts gender norms, impacts relationships, and some of the negative things that come out of that. Like, for example, it asks us to question whether or not we should value romantic relationships over platonic friendships, like meaningful platonic friendships. And if we're limiting ourselves and the depths of those relationships purely because there isn't a sexual component to them. There are so many interesting philosophical questions raised in this book. I'm not going to get into all of them. I really just would recommend that you should read it. As a married bisexual person, I felt like a lot of it was, I found myself identifying a lot with some of the problems raised in this book. For example, the sexually aggressive male, and how that impacts asexual males, and how it also has impacted incels, but in like different polar opposite kind of ways. I found the topic of seeing something as different as an illness to be really relatable. One of the examples is we don't search for a straight gene, we search for a gay gene, that kind of thing. There are just so many thought-provoking discussions in this book. There's a lot about history in here. The book is a study where 100 asexual individuals were interviewed. There's also citations for different studies. There's quotes from bloggers. It was just very comprehensive, a very good qualitative study, I felt. It talked a little bit about aros as well, aromantic people, if you weren't aware. I cannot endorse this book enough. And the other thing I think this book did really well is the intersectionality of being asexual and disability, or asexuality and race, asexuality and gender. It just was so good. The book is only 180 something pages long. It's quite short. That said, it did take me longer to read than I anticipated because I kept putting it down to self-reflect and to connect what I was reading to my own experiences and to the experiences of others I know, and to really process it. And I would kind of recommend reading this book maybe a chapter, or it's split into 3 parts, a part at a time, thinking, reflecting, and then going back in. I will definitely be returning to this book and be dwelling on it for the foreseeable future. So that's my review of Ace. Also, I wanted to comment a little bit about my shirt. So my friend made me this shirt for my birthday. She embroidered it. And they're little like purple flowers. So thank you to my friend. Shout out to them. But I was excited. It also matched the book. But anyhow, on to the next. So for the final book for this video that I want to talk about is She Called Me Woman, Nigeria's Queer Women Speak. So this is a collection of 25 memoirs within a singular book. All of them are from Nigerian people, primarily women, but not all of them identify as women, so that's important to note. And themes in the book were about the gender rigidity within Nigeria's culture and how that affected the LGBTQ plus community specifically, Another theme that came up was violence, domestic violence, being abandoned by family or being forced to marry men. And one theme that kept coming up was this very negative perspective on bisexual women, because people felt like being bisexual in Nigeria meant dating a man and a woman at the same time, or being married to a man but like dating a woman. There were a couple like counter narratives to this, and there were bisexual women represented in the book that explain kind of that experience. But I also think it's important to note the context of Nigerian politics on LGBTQ plus rights. Currently, if you are reported to the police, you can be sentenced to 14 years in prison, which is obviously abhorrent. I learned a lot about Nigeria reading this book, and I thought the themes were really important. My complaints with the book are that I felt like I was doing the research, is what it felt like. And maybe that's because I come from a qualitative study approach. I'm finishing my thesis right now, and it's a qualitative study of interviews and survey responses. And when you do a qualitative study, you take all the information from individuals, and then you organize that information by theme and create some kind of a narrative. Whereas with this, when they kept all of the stories separate, but you could tell that they were based on interviews because the story plot was the same for all of them, even if their answers differed. It just got to be redundant, even though all of their stories were so individualistic. And so I really wish this book would have taken a different approach in how they organized the stories. They could have still kept the voices of the people, kept it as a narrative format of 25 distinct voices, but just organized it better by theme, so that you weren't doing the research yourself. And I think a good example of what I'm talking about is the book When We Crossed the Bridge It Trembled, something like that. I'll put a picture up. But it was about Syrian refugees, and it took their stories and narratives, and each chapter was a different person's perspective, but it was organized in a way that you could easily follow like a timeline, and you can follow the themes in the book. And I just wish this book would have taken that approach. So for that reason, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book as a good book to read for enjoyment, but I did learn a lot, and I do think it's important to highlight LGBTQ issues outside of the United States and Europe. Final thoughts. I would absolutely 100% recommend the Laramie Project and the Laramie Project 10 Years Later. It's a play. If you're new to nonfiction, pick this up. It is so worth the read. Everyone should read it. And it's so relevant to today, even though the initial murder took place in 1998 and the sequel took place in 2008. You will see the parallels to today. 100% recommend. I would equally recommend Ace. I would recommend this book to everyone. As I said before, I already gave this such glowing review. I'm not going to go through it again, but 100% recommend this book. This book, graphic novel, I said I had mixed feelings when I reviewed it. I still have mixed feelings like 2 weeks later. It's a complicated book. I definitely wouldn't read it if you are a kid. But it's complicated and life is messy. So if you like messy, complicated, real-life books, I think you might like this book. And finally, with this book, as I said, I wish it was done better because there is so much missed opportunity in making this like one of the best books. I just think it fell flat. So it's important, but I just felt like the execution was poor. But I still feel like it's important to be educated, so take what you will. I've reviewed other LGBTQ plus nonfiction on my channel. If you want to check out those videos, I have a whole playlist on LGBTQ plus issues here. If you want to see the most recent one I did, which included a memoir, a YA memoir, I'll link that video here. And if you want to see our content in general, please subscribe and ding the bell button. It's free for you, but it helps us out a lot. But we'll keep posting, and I hope you like the video. Comment down below if you have any book recommendations you want me to check out. I am currently on a book buying spree, so please leave your recommendations down below so I can review them on the channel. Bye!